accounted for? Do you know what I mean? Like, do they have, like, if something gets broken during that class, is it a big problem? Is it, you know, like...
Yeah, so basically, and this is where companies have a hard time, particularly if you're running a contract in multiple locations. So as a contractor, you're expected to go in and inspect the government furnished property. Technically, the government should be inspecting their own property first to make sure it works before you send it to us. And then we should be checking it to verify that it's in good working order, that we have all the parts to it, that depending on who's paying for, what's the stuff that makes the weld
wire?
Make sure we have, like, who's paying for weld wire? Is that something we as the contractor are supposed to be providing, or is that something you're providing? So all those kind of things need to be checked, and then we need to keep track. We need to logistically manage where that equipment is. So one of the problems you have is, like, when the government, they used to do this a lot, laptops, give out laptops. And then, so we're giving them out to our employees who are working on that contract. And, you know, John got transferred to Timbuktu, who's working on a totally different contract, takes his laptop with him. And we're not keeping track of that. Those are where you start to come into the problems. Because at the end of the contract, guess what? We're supposed to return all the property back to the government in good working order. So what do you find, how do people communicate with you if there's a problem on the job with a piece of equipment?
So what we have in the federal government are, are called property. So if it's over a certain amount of money, it's considered property, and so then it's nationally given a number and everything, and then we go through every year and check off those numbers, those tags on there. When it's under that, then what I do is I require our contractors to submit every 6 months everything that is there, whether it's broken, not broken. If it's a piece of equipment that really needs to be repaired, like right now, then it's automatic. I'll approve the funding for it to get it fixed. But usually there's at least an inventory once or twice a year, a physical inventory where you actually see the equipment. Things are missing, then what we do is we call it a debt to government. We'll actually bill the vendor for the missing equipment because it's still their responsibility to make sure that it's there and working and doing whatever needs to be done.
Suppose Marianne's teaching a welding class and she, like, not freely, but so to speak, cuts the students loose to practice, like, a vertical weld, whatnot, overhead, and like that piece of equipment gets broken by that student that's, whatever.
But that's normal wear and tear.
Okay, so it's just...
That's what I would consider, and then we would be responsible for repairing it or replacing it.
Because I know that's also a thing in the ISO certification. Like, if you actually hold customer property on your premises, that's a whole other clause that you're going to have to look at. So that's why I was just, sometimes it's best to totally avoid that altogether if you can't, that's why I was like, wait, so if it's government property.
And keep in mind, government property can be things like equipment, like we're talking about. It can be government furnished information that they give you.
So computer systems?
Certain computer access to certain computer systems, right. So, and the government, this whole notion of normal wear and tear, they understand that and have money tied to being able to fix those pieces of equipment. But if they see that you're not storing it correctly, like maybe you're storing something in a really hot warehouse and temperatures are getting up to over 120 in this warehouse, and it causes damage. That's
as long as you can have a CYHO and something negligence, they're
right.
Pretty well cool.
Right.
And if whether or not the government furnished material or equipment is available would be in the solicitation.
Correct. So they'll state that right in the solicitation as to what things are available. Because when you're doing this piece, and here's my class on welding, I want to know what the piece of equipment that they're going to provide versus what is the stuff that I'm going to have to buy, the weld wire. I'm going to have to provide that, where they're going to provide all this stuff. If you have a contract that has a lot of government furnished property on it, you need like a person to track all this stuff because it can end up being very expensive at the end if you can't locate this stuff. So, as a normal rule of thumb, like when you go into government contracting, you should be thinking that you are supposed to be providing all property. It's only special circumstances where the government will provide actual GFP. Typically, they'll do it if there's a significant economy by the government's significant buying power to get price discounts. So if they're supplying welding equipment to 400 job corps centers across the country, they're going to get a much better price than what you're going to be able to get. So that's one reason why they might do government furnished property. They may also want to do standardization throughout the government. So we want everybody who comes through Job Corps to have the same welding experience with this particular type of welding equipment, because that's one of our core objectives, is that they know how to do this. So we want to make sure everybody's using the same thing, standardization. Expedited production. If they give you all the equipment, you can hit the ground running. If they don't give you all the equipment, you're off looking at welding equipment to figure out which one you should buy, which is the best value. You're doing all that. That takes a lot of time. They're giving it to you to get it started right away. Why would it increase competition?
Levels the playing field.
I'm sorry?
It levels the playing field.
Exactly. So everybody's got access to this equipment. I don't have to come up with $650,000 to play in this game. Everybody is going to have the same situation. Some security objectives might be too expensive for contractors. Remember last time we were here, we all talked about cybersecurity, right? And we had Dean go through that whole presentation about how we look at our own sites to verify that we're ready for all these cybersecurity requirements. Some of the things that are required by that may end up becoming government furnished property, because as contractors we may not be able to afford all these security measures, and that might be something where the government steps in and helps out with some of that stuff. And then any other objectives that are considered to be in the best interest of the government would be another reason for GFP. So government furnished property means property that's in possession of or directly acquired by the government. So government retains ownership. They own the equipment. They hold title. And then it's subsequently furnished to the contractor in the performance of a contract. It includes equipment, material, special tooling. So you might be required to produce something for the government, but there's a special tool or a special piece of equipment that is only needed if you're going to be producing something for the government. You don't need it for your commercial use, you just need it for government. They might furnish you that piece of equipment, because again, your price, if you buy it for your contract and then the next company buys it for their contract, the government's paying for it every time a new company comes along. So it ends up being cheaper when they provide it themselves. Sometimes your product has to meet a certain test specification, within a certain standard, right? And they'll give you special test equipment to verify that what you're turning over to the government is within those accuracy. Any kind of plant equipment. Government has to decide what, if any, GFP will be needed for the proposed procurement, and then they notify the contracting officer of the GFP so that they can put in the solicitation document. So that's the cycle within the government for GFP. So what are some issues? Well, first issue is that these two letters have been transposed. Problem two. So what are some of the issues? So the government has liability for the performance of the government furnished property. So as we said, normal wear and tear, they're going to expect that to happen. They have dollars in their O&M budgets, operations and maintenance, to be able to fix that piece of equipment and get it up and running so that you don't have any degradation of contract performance. There's administrative costs and logistics costs for supporting GFP. So as you mentioned, you're going around twice a year, once or twice a year, and eyeballing each piece of equipment, because the contractor's saying, oh yeah, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine. Probably means it's not fine. So
We sold it 2 years ago.
And you'd be really surprised how many folks that work with the federal government or are contracted by the federal government that feel that the government property is for their own personal use and will take it. It's amazing to me. It's like, okay, yeah, not good.
any kind of cost of modifying the government furnished property. So let's say that you want to have tighter tolerances for the welds that you do. You might have to modify the government furnished property. Well, you need to be talking to the Corps to verify that you can in fact do that. The opportunity costs the government furnished property. So who knows what opportunity costs are?
The time you spend looking for things that they don't, is that what you're talking about?
No, opportunity cost is an economic term, and basically what it means is, I'm here with you, teaching this class. I'm not working with another customer doing something different. So there's an opportunity cost with every decision we make, right? You could decide tonight to go home and play with your children, if you have children. Or you could decide to go home and put all your cereal boxes in alphabetical order. You have a choice of how you want to spend the time. But by giving your time to one thing reaps certain benefit, and having your time, hi there, how are you? Hi, Jill. Pleasure to meet you. I thought you were coming tomorrow. Whereas if you do it, if you provide the, so if you give the time to your child today, that will have long-term benefits. If you're organizing your cereal boxes different, if you're ADD, that may be really important to you. But you're taking time away from one thing to give it to another. So when the government is giving you product to work with as government furnished property, they can't be using it in another agency. They can't be using it for another project, which means they're going to have to come up with resources for that other project. So there's always opportunity costs in everything, every decision that we make with regard to government furnished property. The potential impact of the total contract price if government furnished property is provided. So the notion here is that if you give government furnished property to people working on a particular contract, their prices should be lower to you, right? Because you're giving it and you're making it accessible to everybody. They shouldn't have extraordinarily high prices. This is a price reduction strategy for the government by giving you government furnished property. It should also reduce your direct costs, your indirect costs, and your fee. Because remember, your fee is based on total contract value. So if there's $650,000 of additional cost in your contract, what's happening to the profit? You're paying more for that. And then the contractor's thinking to themselves, okay, I've got to have some direct costs to manage that. There's going to be some indirect costs associated with managing that, the administrative functions internally. All those kinds of things are going to be part of this total contract value. So by taking out, in your case, $650,000 worth of revenue, or worth of costs, these other items should go down. But sometimes contractors who are trying to make sure they have a really good profit margin don't think about that. You need to be thinking that the government's expecting a cost reduction because of this. What's going to be the residual value of the items? So what's the residual value? So, if the contract lasts for a year, you might, at the end of the year, the stuff's still in good working order, you might be able to transition it to the next contractor and offer it as government furnished property. Or the government could say, we only needed this equipment for this particular contract. We don't need it anymore. Contractor, do you want to buy it? Like, that's a way of disposing of the equipment. In which case, you now become you're part of contractor debt. Remember we talked about how the contracting officer is setting up invoicing and procedures for things like contractor debt. This would be an example of that contractor debt. If they gave you the option to buy the piece of equipment, if you found it useful to your line of work where the government doesn't need it anymore. But it's in the government's best interest to sort of go on.
And it's at a depreciated cost.
Exactly. So if the government bought the equipment brand new, there would be a certain depreciation schedule, and you would be paying a lower price for that piece of equipment than what the government paid, which may make it in your best interest to do it. The economic benefits of standardization through government furnished property. So keep in mind, if the function that you're providing is a cog in a bigger wheel, the government may not want you to use your particular piece of equipment, because if I learn your piece of equipment, I'm really good at coming to work for you, But as a government employee, I may get transferred to all different kind of Job Corps centers, and the government doesn't, it would be very expensive for the government if they had to train me on each piece of equipment for each of them. So that standardization and the economies of scale because of the standardization is a positive for why you may want to use government furnished property. Estimated residual value of the items. Well, one of the problems that I'll give you, we'll talk about the computers. When the government used to give out computers, laptops, as government furnished property, it was in their best interest to do so because they gave us a computer, it lasted for 3 years, that was typically the lifespan of a computer, and it was replaced by newer technology. So the government didn't really have a lot of, there was no real value to the government to collect those computers back, right? Because you know, the technology had far exceeded it by that point. So they need to be thinking about the residual value of this stuff when they send it back out. The amount offered by the contractor to retain these items, so it becomes a negotiated, what do we think this is worth? Because while if it was a car, we could all agree on maybe the Kelley Blue Book value of the car. Pieces of equipment, you don't necessarily have that same standard tool to figure out how much it should be worth at the time. And then the effect on future competition and contract pricing. You know, these government agencies, because they're all buying things, like I remember I walked through Department of Agriculture, and they're in a beautiful building, old federal building down in DC, and yet you walk through and there's like hallways and hallways and hallways of just crap, you know, like just desks and tables and chairs and all this other kind of stuff. And you know, you can tell it's not categorized or cataloged so that if you needed to get equipment, like you wouldn't know where to find anything in this heap, and yet it's all there, you know? So they can't get rid of it. They're buying more of it, and yet they've got all this stuff that's sitting there. Okay, any questions about government furnished property? Would you like to see more of my teaching demonstration? Should I go into another module, or are we good? We're good? Okay. All right, I'll see you guys tomorrow morning. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.